important. It could be a little bit with the weather too.
Yeah.
Because it's like going crazy out here right now. Nice to get you on the live feed.
What's that?
I said nice to get you on the live feed.
Oh yeah.
You're really getting a lot of attention these days.
It's gas, isn't it? It's suddenly just exploded out of nowhere. Then now other people are downloading my stuff and making videos on YouTube. It's pretty funny.
I think it's because I've been trying to explain this to people before. The whole authenticity. You seem so real. You're not coming from some ivory tower academic stuff.
Yeah, well that's true. Well, that's how I am.
It's just like having a conversation with someone in real life that's actually got a lot of life experience and some real genuine stories about these things.
Oh, thank you for that. Well, that was the idea behind the whole thing. I wanted to demystify it and to just, if you were having a conversation with a person in a pub, that's what it's like, you know.
And I was having, you actually inspired me a lot because I had a long discussion with my partner about the whole authenticity and the whole ivory tower problem, that people are so paralyzed that they don't dare think for themselves anymore.
Oh, well, that's deliberate. The education system is designed to produce repeaters and indoctrination. You know, you're rewarded. The education system rewards the people who are the most indoctrinated. You know, if you repeat the things the most, you'll get the best rewards, you'll get the best qualifications, and ultimately this will serve you in your employment after you leave your education. So it's really all about, it's a reward system based on, you know, indoctrination to the highest level, not on creative cognitive abilities and awareness, exploration, you know.
But they've managed to even remove something like common sense.
Oh yeah, of course. That's very important. They're trying to create a new culture. They're trying to create a brand new global culture that's a one-size-fits-all, and it's just business. It just makes their political business, their corporate business, and their social engineering business more seamless across borders if they can implement a global culture, even if it goes against common sense, and even if it makes no cultural sense, or even if it goes against human, you know, biological sense. It's still what they want, because they want to streamline human behavior, and you know, and they have been at this for a very, very long time, but technology now allows them to do it, you know, much more efficiently. Look how they treat these, what they call rogue nations, who decide to exist outside the Western paradigm. Look at ethnic groups like gypsies, how they have been traditionally reviled, and I might say by governments more than anything else, because gypsies are outside the Western paradigm in terms of their whole culture, and I find them a very, very fascinating group.
Oh yeah, they're very much out of reach. The tendrils are not in them. They are so much off-grid, not just technologically or culturally, but also socially. They don't need anyone else. They are so used to living by themselves and by their own power.
Yeah, how I first became interested was about 5 or 6 years ago. I was talking to a doctor who worked in a maternity hospital in Dublin, and he told me that, like, normally those women don't go into hospitals to deliver babies. Their babies are delivered at home. So this woman was on the street, this Roma gypsy woman, and she went suddenly into labour, and they brought her to the maternity hospital, and the doctor said this woman was remarkably healthy. It was the healthiest mother he'd ever seen in in the maternity hospital in his 20 years of working there, and he said she gave birth with very little pain. It was her second child, and the child came out. He said the child was far more aware and alive in terms of its responses than, you know, the typical sort of Irish Western baby would be delivered. He said the mother's health was remarkable. Everything was perfect. Her heart rate, her breathing rate. They took a blood test, and he just said he was struck by, she was probably the most healthy human being he'd ever seen, and the baby was probably the most healthy baby. And what also he said struck him was that she was terrified of everything in the hospital. She didn't want injections. She didn't want a blood test. She didn't want anything for the baby done. She just wanted the baby immediately in her hand, and she held the baby to her heart and held it there until her family came along and literally pulled her out of the hospital. So they were very polite. Thank you very much. Thank you for looking after our sister and whatever. But they made a run for it, and that really made me realise that these people, they gain so much from being outside the system, not just in terms of the cultural things, but also in terms of their physical health.
It's also related to the whole thing of the fact that these people, they are not surrounded by these mechanisms, these ways of thinking that we are so used to, right? We touched upon symbols and things like that, and you mentioned that she was afraid of the hospital ward. Well, if you think about how a hospital ward is designed and what it looks like and feels like, it's very unhealthy to your mental state.
Yes, especially the things like the fluorescent lights. I find when I was in hospital, I found the most difficult thing of all to deal with was the fluorescent lighting. I don't know why I have such a difficulty with fluorescent lighting, but I really can't deal with it at all. And I actually felt that it was actually detrimental to my recovery.
I actually have a sort of an explanation for that. The human brain and the human sight is designed to work on a flicker frequency of about 25 images per second. This is also what you use when you do video. But if you want to embed something in between the flickers, then you actually have to have a higher frequency than your flicker frequency. So it is kind of weird that the current flicker of fluorescent light and any artificial light is actually about 50, which is exactly
twice.
It's exactly twice. So you can actually have a whole alternate reality embedded in the same frequency. That means that you are getting stressed because you are getting more flicker information than you can handle.
Yes, and I found that very, very profoundly when I worked in office buildings. When I went from working day shifts to night shifts, I liked office buildings with lots of natural sunlight coming in. And that's very interesting because when I took up the night shift, I actually felt my health declining, and I thought it was because of the hours. I now have come to realize it was because of the fluorescent lighting, and as you say, the flicker rate is unnatural. And when you're in a room completely engulfed and trapped within that, absorbed by it, you know, how can your physiological health function properly? This is also why there's a big drive to get these things into our homes, you know, these incandescent light bulbs and stuff. Exactly. They want to remove them and replace them with the CFL bulbs. And
what's really unique about the new kind of fluorescent light is that it doesn't have that obvious on-off effect as
the ballast has to charge.
Now it's more like a dimming and brightening.
Yes.
And it's actually not turning off the light. It's just making sure that everything is like pulsing. So you're getting that same state as if there's a hum visually in your mind. And this is also, if you look at stuff, things like strobe lights. That strobe lights can get you nauseous and make you sick, and even get you to have seizures. And if you look at the studies in things like binaural beats, these sound waves that are designed to create artificial rhythm underneath to excite your brain, your higher brain functions. If you take all these things together, it's all very much a part of setting a mood. If you ask magicians or those charlatan spiritists and people like that how they get the mood right, this is exactly what they do. They make sure that the lighting, that the ambience, the room frequency, everything is fitted to the seance.
Yes, well, light has, the whole concept of the light can be used in two ways, to illuminate or to blind. When you're being interrogated by the police or by some kind of security agency, they stand behind the light and they point it into your face. This is to distort you. Your actual neurological responses are quite different because the light causes you not to think. It causes you to blurt out something. And so they're trying to catch you, or they're trying to get you more likely to incriminate yourself, even if you're innocent. Which actually, now that you mentioned the music thing and the beats, this brings us back to the gypsies again. And gypsy music is fascinating. It's the last form of music left in Western tradition that it isn't based on the the Pythagorean musical scale, the tonic scale of do re mi. It doesn't have that, and it's a very different kind of music. And I find whenever I listen to that live, play it has a completely different emotional resonance than to listening to even beautiful works of classical music or pop music or whatever. It has a very, very different feel. It just sounds intrinsically more natural to me or something.
Have you looked into the whole discussion going on at the moment about the harmonies and the scales and the solfeggio?
You're talking about how the Nazis altered the musical scale.
Someone did.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of this stuff that's very interesting to me as well. Why do all LP records turn at 33 RPMs? I find that very interesting, It seems as if that's an occult number. Excuse me. Pardon me. They turn at 33 RPMs, that's an occult number. Why that number? Does it tie in with the something to do with electric motors, that they find that speed gave you the best sounds? I'm very interested in that. And why were records originally wax records and gramophone records 78, which is also the number of cards in the tarot? I find that very interesting as well. It's just like. It seems the whole music business, right from its inception, seemed to have this occultic overtone to it.
But don't you think that it's also, it's not just conscious choice, that there is also a lot of influence from the subconscious choice? Of course, then you can get into the whole thing that these people have been putting these numbers and these symbols into our psyche. Using things like architecture and art, but then when you have you think you have the free choice, like what did they call the detector in the cyclotron? It's called the Aleph detector. Aleph being the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's just when you are so used to surrounding yourselves with these symbols, then when you have the ability to create an invention, like let's say a record player, then it would be natural to you to choose something that you are familiar with, something that's in the back of your mind, like something pre-programmed.
Yes, I agree with that. I do believe that's absolutely true. There could very well be technical reasons for why the motors turned at 78 and 33. I'm not that well versed in sort of, electromechanic motors to know that. But I just found that those numbers were very specific, and they were very particular numbers in terms of the occult resonance. And do these things impinge on people's subconscious? I absolutely think that's true. I think when people go into to study architecture, there'll be a certain element of their studies will be around, traditional and classical architecture, the golden section and so on, and things like the geometric shapes of various classical buildings like the Parthenon in Athens. And then they will subconsciously apply this even to things like everything from designing a school to a modern office building. I've seen that all the time, actually. I go around everywhere now, and modern buildings do have these, we'll call them, I guess, a homage, a sort of a subliminal homage to the classical traditions in architecture in terms of layout and design, and that's absolutely there to be seen. I've seen that even in things like in the way shop fronts are designed. It's not self-conscious. The actualization of the process begins at a subconscious level from everything they get from their school books when they were in kindergarten, to even looking at the size and shape of a television screen or a computer monitor. These things are in there and they manifest. Now, having said that, the original impetus behind them going back to the classical world, what was the initial driver of that, of developing these frameworks and these limitations in terms of these I guess we'll call them archetypal geometric forms. That's the only phrase I can really come up with now for them. But they say they came from nature, and in terms of the golden section, that definitely seems to be true in terms of the number sequences like the Fibonacci sequence and so on. However, it did take a long time. The Fibonacci sequence wasn't developed until the Renaissance, the early Renaissance. So it took a long time to get that far. So I'm one of these people that definitely comes from the belief that they're prior to, what we would call Babylonian civilization to today, that there definitely was and several other, very, well, I wouldn't say advanced, but very significant and complex would be the word I would use, societies and civilizations that existed before them. And I think that is actually the root of so much what we call classical literature, and a bit specifically in Babylonia, the Babylonian context, where basically all our Western culture comes from in terms of those things. You can trace back just about so many corporate logos and everything back to symbolism used in Babylonia and Sumeria to depict certain gods in a graphical form. You can see them all there. You can see the Texaco logo and everything, and these things have been burnt into the subconscious from that time. But I don't think they started in Babylon. I think they came to Babylon from somewhere else.
I was actually intrigued at something you mentioned in another interview. You were touching upon ancient Irish symbolism and mythology.
Yeah.
And I think it's very much related. It's now I don't want to jump straight into the whole Terence McKenna and small elves, but I will actually hint at the fact that some people might be more sensitive or able to communicate these phenomenon in a way that normal people don't, because they don't have the language skills. I tend to say that these discoveries must have been made by either shamans or communicated by chieftains or kings.
Yes, I agree, and it was probably through, I don't know if you've read Graham Hancock's Supernatural. The book is probably terribly overwritten, but the fundamental crux, I think he was trying to impress mainstream academics who'll never be impressed with his work and his research anyway, just because he's not one of them.
Exactly.
So unfortunately, what could have been one of the greatest books ever written and most important books ever written has a tendency that he tended to overwrite it and overstate the argument. But at the crux crux at the very heart of supernatural. And I actually think of many. It is this when you mentioned the ancient Irish motifs and stuff like that you would see on these various tombs and monuments around Ireland and around Europe in general. There's these actual shapes, there's a certain group of them. There's a group of about 15 of them that have been identified. If you put an electric current to a brain, into a certain parts of the brain, while a human being has their eyes closed or they're in a dark room, they will start to see shapes. They tend to be everything from a circle with a dot in the middle, and then this kind of star shapes. And this is probably what the first artists, the cave artists, saw when they were in the dark. They're maybe aided by hallucinogenic substances such as Liberty Cap mushrooms or whatever the local transcendental foliage was that brought them to that state. But definitely that's it. That's where it all comes from. But even that in itself is interesting, because that showed up when the development of the frontal lobes and the frontal cortexes of the human brain appeared, and so did language, and so did art at the same time. There's some very good, I would say, anecdotal evidence to suggest that perhaps human beings come into contact with what we would call shamanistic plants actually launched the modern man away from the earlier sort of prototypical human beings into what we would call modern man in terms of our cognitive processes and our actual self-actualization in terms of coming to terms with what we are. I think it's a great argument to be made for that.
And also it's when early or primitive man came into contact not just with the effects of the entheogens and things like that, but also, I believe, phenomenon that is strange. Once you actually start thinking about it, it's kind of weird. Like if you didn't have the math to describe something like the Fibonacci numbers, right? It's profound to see these patterns of pentagons in plants, different plants, in trees. The fact that your foot is the length of your arm, the fact that your thumb is a fraction of the next finger. All these magical phenomena that I believe, to explain them, of course it must have taken some sort of special person, and I keep coming back to the shaman, that he must have been thinking about these things and trying to make heads and tails of it, and then put them into some sort of magical system by having a sort of a grimoire or a system of language to describe that. And this is also what you see in the memory techniques with the rules of three and things like verse to describe plants.
Yes.
And one of the things that I think is profound, especially with Irish culture, is that it has retained so much of that underneath, right?
I think that was true until about 20 years ago, and I've actually seen a deterioration in that. I would say that the generations today, the ones not involved in, say, music, traditional music or dance or something, they've definitely lost it. You would get it in people who would be involved in arts. I'm not talking about like the main arts, I'm talking about like even kids who are interested in it just as a hobby, which still exists actually quite surprisingly to a large degree here. That was probably a sort of you think of like, what is culture and how does culture survive? Well, it's sort of like a sense of secret symbols, secret, I don't know, it's all these nuances that exist below the actual overriding obvious culture, where two people from the same culture can arrive in a different part of the world, and they may be from different class structures within that culture, but they can recognize and talk to each other in a way that they couldn't talk to someone from Denmark, or someone from Denmark couldn't talk to someone from Italy. It's just the way it is. There is a relative language, a lexicon of consciousness that exists within cultures, and this is why I think there's a great obsession with destroying cultures within this sort of new political framework, this global framework they're developing. There is I call it the lexicon of the absolute and the relative. I use this for a lot of things: my art, my writing, my work on psychopaths. There's it's that interrelation between what is obvious and what is known, and then what is the subtle the subtle undercurrent below that. And I believe the actual relative nature of the human condition is far more important than any kind of surface level cultural or educational or political or any kind of ego-based overcoat. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's a subtle undercurrent, of the relative, that lexicon of the relative below the absolute, which is the defining factor in cultures. And I think this is extremely threatening and extremely dangerous to any sort of political structure, or especially a commercial structure. But believe it or not, an educational structure would probably see it as the most dangerous threat of all. One of the things constantly fascinates me about going around Ireland, you can go around the most remote parts of Ireland. I'm talking about like really, mountainous areas that are pretty remote today, but 100 years ago or 150 years ago, they would have been incredibly remote. They still had public school systems. These people had nothing else. They had, a lack of food, a lack of everything in their lives, but their children were still forced to go to school. And the reason for that was they were indoctrinating future generations towards the political and social structure. And this is why they wouldn't, you would have like when the British government at that time ran Ireland, you would have extensive parliamentary debates regarding funding, say, people who were dying of starvation. Should we send them a bit of food in certain areas? But when it came to something like, shall we have a very expensive school buildings program in these remote mountain regions, and the same thing happened in Scotland and Wales, absolutely, that was signed off right away. Why? Because they knew the purpose of indoctrinating these sort of, like, we will call them the Celtic fringe people, as they're known, into the Anglo-Saxon cultural framework was extremely important, and it was the most important thing. And that's why they went to such extremes to push their education system in there. Because I can tell you, these people were very different. If you still, like when I was a kid, there were still remote islands off the coast of Ireland you could actually visit on your summer holidays. And these people were just like the gypsies I spoke about earlier on. They had a very different way of seeing the world, and that was because they were not exposed to the same kind of culture the rest of us were. They were much more right-brain focused. I've met some of the most, I would say, intellectually astute people. Now, not in terms of their overall sort of book smarts, but definitely in terms of their inquisitive nature for learning and knowledge, would be like toothless farmers on the side of mountains who've never left a mountain. It's because they haven't been culturally polluted. They have retained an ability to see, they retain the cognitive process which allows them a more holistic view of reality, and as a result, they're open to things the rest of us are not. It's really, really interesting when you see how different these people are. Even the way the Irish, a few years ago, I tried to learn Egyptian hieroglyphs because I thought that would really help my right brain. Because the hieroglyphs are more pictorial in nature rather than written symbols. And the book that I had was terribly disappointing, and so was all the textbooks I could find. What basically did was they invented this thing called, in the Victorian era, called transliteration, which turns the image of the pictograph into a word, basically, and then you're right back to zero. You're back in your left brain again. So the lengths that they have gone to keep us locked in the left brain is really quite astounding. And the only reason for that is that a brain that's finely balanced between left and right is one that's it's less easier to mold.
One of the things that I keep coming back to from the inspiration of your work is this collaboration between the actual powers that control things. That is, of course, directly related to the topic of the psychopath, but also to the way that the victims, the herd, co-creates that character. And thus, you don't need the psychopath anymore. You don't need a policeman in the street to be afraid of the policeman. You don't need a king to be afraid of the king. You put him in your own mind, very much in the same way that that Freud talked about how your relationship to your father creates that super ego thing that keeps punishing you even though he's not there anymore. It's just... How do you think, how much is actual direct influence and conscious influence from psychopathic people and behavior, and how much is actually our own misinterpretation or feeding that myth?
I have to think about this for a second. Yes, there's a symbiotic relationship between the psychopath and the victims. Absolutely. One could not exist without the other. It is the positive and negative. There's a polarity there that's absolutely vital for the process to happen. Having said that, indigenous cultures have less issues with psychopaths than the Western society does. And that's because Western society, psychopaths are very useful for the overall agenda that Western society has in terms of the consumer culture. It's extremely necessary for that. So the psychopath becomes almost like the folk hero and the enemy at the same time. On one hand, we have a superficial moral structure which says, "Oh, these people are bad; they're wicked." If you're in a relationship with one of them, or if you're in, if you're depending on one to save your life or enhance your life on a personal level. However, they're fantastic in terms of big business, and that's where we're told that that's what's needed. That movie Wall Street, the scene where Michael Douglas announces to the shareholders that greed is good. Now, the shareholders they're shocked, but you can see it's a superficial shock. On one hand, they're saying we're respectable business people. We don't want to be involved with someone who's just ruthless. But the reality is, he was giving them the devil that they wanted. He was giving them. He was manifesting within that sort of business structure to give them what they desired the most. In the same way, there's you'll have a situation where somebody will attract a psychopath into their personal life for whatever reason, sexual, financial. You will have like a wealthy male attracting a psychopathic poor female who's a money grabber, who's just based. So essentially, it's it's almost a form of sacred prostitution when you start looking at his side of the things, And you see this with like rich old guys married to wealthy old guys married to rich, to young girls who are like 40 years younger than them, and they're models or whatever. And the same thing happens it's happening increasingly now with like toy boys. Particularly amongst the gay community, you'll see a lot of wealthy elderly gay guys going into civil partnerships with very attractive young males. And it's the same thing again. So, and then we see that on TV, and then we say to ourselves, "Oh, she's only with him for the money. Oh, he's only with her for the money." And yet we claim to be repulsed by this. We claim that there's something inherently wrong with this. Yet all those people who are saying that, if they had the wealth of that person, they would probably be buying themselves a young model themselves. So it's almost like that kind of behavior exists for us to superficially point a finger at it and say, "Hey, what they're doing is morally wrong." But it's only morally wrong from the viewpoint that we financially and economically can't afford it.
Yeah, and I was I actually want to back you up a little bit, because there's one thing that you touched upon earlier in relation to secret societies, and how these institutions can be potentially used or entered by both types of human beings, both psychopaths and normal human beings. And it's actually a little bit the same with Wall Street. I would like for your comment on that, because if you view Wall Street, depending on who is actually watching that movie, it will have two different messages.
Yes.
And you see this extremely well in kind of the follow-up to Wall Street, not the new one, but actually the movie Boiler Room, where you have some of these financial traders are sitting in a social gathering, and they are actually watching Wall Street, quoting it as if it's a Bible.
Yes.
So my point is that to some people, to those inclined to that way of thinking, that movie is actually not a moral fable. On the contrary, it's a teaching device.
Yes. And that happens. That's a very interesting human trait. Not only regard pathologies and negative behavior and justifying negative behavior. I know people who are like recovered alcoholics who watch movies like, Clean and Sober, and watch movies about people who or drug addicts will watch movies like Drugstore Cowboy, and they'll almost it becomes almost like a canon to them. It becomes almost like a biblical version of their own lives on the big screen. It becomes sort of this this sort of narrative, this sort of it's almost semi-autobiographical, and I find that very interesting, that people develop an interest in something and suddenly they want to watch movies about it. And even if it's something like they have a problem with drugs, they want to watch movies about drugs. They have a problem with alcohol, that they have a problem with sex, the same thing. It's a very interesting human trait, and I don't think I fully understand what the thrust is behind it. But it's that's what you were talking about. And these guys are watching the Wall Street movie as if it was sort of a primer. That was their mission statement. That was their Quran. To follow, to live their code of living for them to live by. Yes, but you see that in all kinds of things. It's a very, very strange human trait.
But isn't that very much linked to the whole idea about humans telling only stories that are about humans and about the human condition and the psychodynamics of the human condition? I was amazed at, I've been following some of the whole current gender wars and the portraying of I think you would maybe put them in the category of psychopathic females. One of the things that I found funny was that you have that traditional Irish image of that demon woman thing. What's
the Leanne and she?
Yeah. It's as if this is something that's been there always. This is not a new phenomenon, and this is very much also related to, you were touching upon the story of Bram Stoker and vampirism.
Henry Irving, yeah.
It's as if it's the same players.
Yeah, it's the same players, and it's a constant need as humans, move through history, that they need to put an allegorical tag upon it. It's always been there. There's always been this sort of need. You see, human beings will go through extraordinary lengths not to confront their faults. This is a big issue with human beings. I don't know how long this has been around, but it's been around, hundreds of years at least. Human beings would rather go into madness, or rather go into self-destruction, than actually come to terms with their shadow. They will go to extraordinary lengths to deny that, to to not accept it. So you could have a situation where, like, this is a big aspect of my work with psychopaths, and this is why I'm glad when I first started to deal with the issue of psychopaths, I didn't deal with it through writing, I didn't deal with it through reading, I dealt with it, or even through therapy, I dealt with it through my art and through my creativity and through paintings, and that really was a blessing for me, because that allowed me to realize that this is a very important journey that one must take in their personal development. And this is why a lot of people who've been affected by psychopaths, one in the workplace, say like a really crazy psychopathic boss or a politician or a relationship, they come out extremely angry, extremely driven, and the basic attitude is then that everybody who's ever wronged them in their life or is ever going to wrong them in the future is a psychopath. And this is extremely wrong, because this is not how you should approach the issue, because it's ultimately self-destructive. And that's also part of the shadow. They won't use the experience to look at themselves in the mirror and say to themselves, well, what is it about me that brought this experience into my life? Because I can tell you for a fact, I can tell you this is absolutely true, Jakob. Nobody has encountered a psychopath by accident. Nobody. It's okay. It's not. I'm talking about in a personal one-to-one situation. What regards a dictator or a despot, that's a different thing altogether. But nobody, when the demon has knocked at the door, right, and you have the choice to open or close that door, and you not coming to terms with that, you will never become sane again. You will always carry within you an element of pollution, a psychological pollution that was left from the experience. You have to come to terms with the fact, just like when the vampire knocks at the door in the vampire novel, you have a choice to let him in or not. Just like when the devil knocks at the door, you have the choice. And people, rather than coming to terms with that they brought this on themselves to a degree now, they're not completely their fault, until they realize that they haven't partaken in a symbiotic kind of ballet or symbiotic tango of host and parasite, of positive and negative. Everything is dualistic and everything is symbiotic in terms of psychology as well, that they will never recover from this. Now, my own issues, I'm not going to go into what led me to this, but it basically comes from my family background. That's where it really began, but I'm not going to go into details. But this has been a lifelong process for me to try and deal with this. And then I realized that every single other psychopathic individual whom I encountered in business or in the music industry or just as a friendship were nothing more than a reworking of the original initial psychopathic experience, which I hadn't processed in a healthy or in a logical manner. And it wasn't until I did that it all up, and I never had the problem ever again. And I'm so glad that I had things like music and art to get me through that, because it wasn't done through a left brain process. It was done through a right brain process, and then I went into the study afterwards, and it made an awful lot more sense to me. So that's why this is like one of the things, and I still get a lot of emails and a lot of flack about this. How can people say to me, how can you say that encountering a psychopath is a positive experience? They just don't get it. They just don't want to accept. They want to stay in it's an infantilism, and they want to stay in a state of eternal blame or eternal victimhood. They do not want to grow from the experience. And this is why I believe it's an evolutionary experience. And I'm talking about evolution, and not only in the Darwinian sense. I'm talking about evolution with capital letters right across, spiritual, psychological, you name it, every other way. This is the whole thing. If you don't learn from a mistake, you're condemned to repeat them. And this is what the psychopathic experience is. And this is what it represents in every way. And this is where allegory and metaphor of things like vampires and werewolves come from. People in the past were just like people today. They did not want to come to terms with the shadow part of themselves, which attracted this aspect, the psychopath or the psychopathic experience into their consciousness. And that's where my work differs quite differently from many others. I want people to know that.
But isn't it also, because now that you touch upon it, isn't it also a sort of legit way of telling these stories with a function without actually, well, I call it spooking the psychopath? Because if you were teaching your kids in your village about actually real psychopaths, then the real psychopaths would respond. They would feel attacked or cornered.
Yes, and also you're dealing with historical legacies as well. That, like, you in the past, in Western Christian societies, maybe not so much in say the Hindu society in India, where you had traditions like the Nats who and other Sindar traditions, which were very open towards sexual realities that the West wasn't. You couldn't actually come around and say there are these things called pedophiles who have sex with children. So you would invent the likes of Hansel and Gretel or Little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah, exactly.
And you couldn't, because you couldn't explain to them, well, what is rape? Well, it's when a man holds a woman down and does this. How could you explain that to them when you couldn't even give them the basic facts of life? I mean, it's been shown now that up until the late Victorian era, among the peasantry in Europe, there was still a certain ignorance as to where children came from. They, because people were having sex all the time and babies just seemed to appear. So unless you have a stop, that kind of a thing, you don't know. Many cultures still thought, until like say 150 years ago, that just getting married, the actual act of marriage, produced the baby. It's very strange. It's just because this is because of the prohibitions from religion upon sexual realities that denied people the truth of what was going on, and hence that's where these fairy tales came from. You couldn't how can you explain to a child what a pedophile is when you don't even know how your own children came about?
And also, in your individual description of psychopaths, right, where one psychopath is acting upon a victim, there is also that whole control of sexuality, and about how it's done, and who takes charge and who commands everything, and you were talking about taking the word out of the mouth of the victim. Isn't it kind of the same with society, how some sort of psychopathic social structure have done exactly the same
in terms of sexual realities and sexual
oppression?
acceptance?
Now we are coming to terms with it, and we're liberating our personal understanding of sexuality, but for a long time we've been in a victim situation where the people have actually been victimized by a psychopathic entity or social structure that's actually taken away that control, that freedom.
Well, that's absolutely true, and I'll tell you where that really shows up is if you look at pornography. If you look at pornography in different cultures, it's actually quite an interesting insight into that culture. American pornography is fascinating. It's what you're basically being given is a neuroses. You'll have like American women, in pornographic films today will generally be shaven. There'll be no pubic hair, and you'll have things like piercings and nipples. You won't have actual close-ups of certain acts where you go to say, and that shows a sort of I don't know if it's a sexual immaturity. Actually, I think it is, and there's also some very interesting self-loathing aspects there in relation to the obsession with anal sex and things like that. And there's also you're getting insights into neuroses as well, with this whole idea of that the what they call the MILFs, the women, the mothers I'd love to fuck thing, they're actually getting younger and younger, and you have like 18 and 19-year-old actors porn actresses playing this. This is an erotic insight into the terror when Americans of their own mortality. They won't accept it, so they keep pushing old age younger and younger. And you see this also in things like advertising for anti-aging cream. They have like an 18-year-old model. She's like worried about wrinkles. She's still in high school, and that you see that in the pornography as well. Where in other societies you have strange aspects of pornography, like in India, the pornography, the women are definitely light skinned. And they'll often dye their hair blonde, and the men will be light-skinned as well. So there's almost like a racial self-hatred within that aspect of pornography. And then you have other societies like Ireland and even France to an extent, where there's very little interest in pornography. And it's not because of a sexual repression. It's just there just isn't really, that kind of a thing. It's the strangest thing, and it's just the lack of interest in pornography in society, in certain cultures, may also be a neuroses in itself, born out by religious oppression that was relatively recent, or maybe guilt, or maybe the idea contraception wasn't as freely available, and things like that. But the impact of pornography within societies is an extremely interesting place to go, and it's worthy of study in terms of how we come to terms with the soul and the spirit and the psyche of modern human beings, because there's it's a taboo to even think about this stuff or talk about it. But if the likes of Freud and Jung were around today, I'm sure they'd be writing volumes on pornography, and how because that's where neuroses is being expressed in the modern age.
I think they might not actually even have so much to say, because there would be so much available drugs and pornography, so they might be busy and not actually write anything. But I like you to touch upon the importance of gender roles in relations to psychopathy, because you mentioned American pornography, and there's a lot of documentaries about gender roles and how they've developed over the last 50 years. The fact that G.I. Joe figures have increased their chest size something like 60-80% or something like that, and the woman shape has now gone from mature into something infantile,
the Barbie doll looks really young now compared to the Barbie doll of 40 years ago.
Yeah, she's not even popular anymore. Now it's those brats, which is basically kids, right?
Yeah, they're sort of like they almost look like fetuses in bad clothes or something.
Yeah.
It's very creepy. And this is another interesting thing about that is I remember years ago I was watching some TV show in the US about they gave a group of black children, young black girls, African American girls. They gave them dolls, and they gave them a choice between a white doll and a black doll. Now the white and the black doll were exactly the same. They had the same hair, in terms of the facial features, everything was identical. The clothes, the only thing that different was the black doll had black hair and had brown skin, the African American doll, but it was identical in every other anatomical aspect in terms of the facial construction and everything. In every single case, these young African American girls chose the white doll, and the reason why was because they all said the same thing: she's prettier. And that's how powerful this stuff is, and how frightening it is in terms of manipulating the psyche of individuals to the point where it develops an entire culture of self-hatred. And this is one of the great tragedies of the modern world, is how the African American has been treated post-slavery. We hear so much about how they were treated when they became slaves, and all to the American civil rights and Martin Luther King. But then after that, we don't really hear too much. Well, not in the white media. When I lived in New York, I used to listen to black radio stations all the time, and especially at night when you'd have talk shows. I found them tremendously interesting. And they were awake and aware of what most whites are today, way back then in the 90s. And they would talk about things like, as soon as the civil rights thing came in, and Martin Luther King, and post Martin Luther King, post Malcolm X, you started having these black exploitation movies where the male was like was dressed in the most bizarre sort of comical clown clothes. He had huge haircuts. He was a womanizer. The women were strong models, role models, but they were taught to be independent of a man. And what they basically did was and through the welfare program in the US, they basically destroyed the African American family, where the father was never home. The father was always away. The father left. The song from the 60s, "Papa Was a Rolling Stone." That's a folk song, really. It's giving you an insight into what happened to culture. And you'd have like 30 or 40 years of the African American family where predominantly you would have females raising the sons, and this created a disconnect where you'd have like an overdependence on the mother, a sort of a very unhealthy Oedipus complex, and a father who never came home until the presidential elections in 2008, when Daddy came home in the guise of Barack Obama. Daddy came home. They brought Daddy home. The same people who removed Daddy through their welfare programs, destroyed the African American family, performed their sorcery, and in 2008 in the presidential elections, Daddy came home for the African American family. And this is how they behave, and this is how the psychopathic control grid behaves. It takes away with one hand, it denies you for a while, and then it gives you what you thought you always wanted for in a form which suits them.
You talked about how this is always voluntary to some extent. How do you think that teaching people about the warnings and the things to look out for as an individual in relation to defending yourself against psychopathic persons, really, how do you think that can be scaled up, so to speak? Can the same rules be somehow used to teach you about how also to do that in relationship to bigger systems like society and
absolutely
culture?
Intuition. This is a big aspect here where our intuition is switched on because we have pundits, and even amongst what we would call this scene here the awakening or the alternative research, we have our pundits too. And I'll tell people not to even trust what I'm saying. Go out and do your own research, and then verify it, or just come to say, oh well, Thomas Sheridan's talking bullshit, and then do your own thing. But this is because we're handing over our intuition constantly. What we have to do is to develop our intuition in this, just like it's an organ. It's just like any other aspect of our being. It's there for a reason and exists for a reason. It's a feedback mechanism that seems to operate between our heart and our solar plexus and our frontal cortexes, and it gives us a small faint signal of when something is right or something is wrong. When something is wrong it gives us what we would call the red flag. Now, we have been trained to suppress these things, but also our ego will suppress them as well. If you're a woman who encounters a psychopathic man and the red flags go off now and again, like he does things like have, a temper tantrum or, an explosive rage. But if he's really good looking and have lots of money, she'll switch off her intuition and ignore her red flags. And every single person who's ever been through the personal psychopathic experience always says the same things. My intuition was switched off, and I ignored the red flags because my ego was on top of that, telling me, well, you'll lose this, you'll lose that, so play the game. And that's what goes on in at the greater level as well. Intuition is probably the most lost and forgotten internal psychological and emotional resource we have, that we have that we have abandoned. Well, we haven't abandoned it. It's actually been educated out of us. We've got to get that sorted. We got to get that back. And I mean, I don't know what it is now, but like I think also creativity is very, very good for that. I find creative people have tremendous intuitive values and very good intuitive responses. They know when things are going on. So do elderly women for some reason, and so do gay men. I'm not sure why, but gay men have phenomenal intuition.
I think it's scientific.
It's not just towards sexual politics. They're amazing when it comes to lots of things.
I think there's
a tremendous intuition.
There's scientific reasoning behind that. I remember seeing something about the size of the part in your brain that governs empathy. And one of the things that, of course, it does not make you gay to have increased empathy, but it makes you prone to have a tendency towards that. So there is actually some scientific proof for that.
There you go. Yeah.
Exactly.
There you go. So that's where you get the intuitive gay man from. That's very interesting. And the mother too. You know, they found that. I think I read somewhere that women who've had more children tend to be more intuitive as well. This could be from just motherhood, of actually observing their children growing up and developing a skill set from that. But intuition, absolutely. It's like I mean, you know, I think I'm always amazed by how the lack of intuition that many people have. I mean, to me from day one it was obvious that Al Gore with his whole man-made climate change thing was a complete bullshitter. It was completely sold on fake emotions, you know, neuro-linguistic programming. If you watch his movie, it's an Inconvenient Truth documentary. It's a masterclass in neuro-linguistic programming. The music reaches a certain crescendo when he starts talking about polar bears. There's even the scene where he ascends on the cherry picker up the graph to imply him as a sort of Christ-like figure who's been the guy who lost the election to Bush, but he has risen from the dead like Christ to ascend and save us as the climate man, you know, as the climate Christ. The climate Christ has risen, and this is the oldest trick in the book, and I'm amazed. And when I remember watching that movie for the first time in a friend's house, I was literally rolling on the floor laughing. And the other people in the room were like, "You're not concerned about this?"
Well, it's because people have not been taught classical rhetoric. They do not know how presentation is done. They don't know how we are manipulated emotionally. You don't have to go all the way to something like Inconvenient Truth. You can just go to something like you talked about. Movies like American Psycho, and you talked about some of the old horror movies. The way that people use cutting techniques, rhythm, music, to set moods,
and pauses, method acting. Yes,
it's all the same thing. It's all mechanics. It's all stage show. It's all sound and fury.
Theater.
It's theater, and the fact that people.
Well, that's where it comes from. It comes from you know, Tudor times. It comes from Shakespeare. That was when they first, and then it goes back probably a little further to
all the way to the Greeks.
Yeah, you know, that's why they built amphitheaters They built amphitheaters all over the Greek and Roman empires in the middle of nowhere for the same reason the British built public schools in the middle of Ireland in the middle of nowhere. Same reason. Indoctrinate the masses
and give you fake experiences, which is maybe
fake experiences. Yeah.
Because when you are in a situation where you are watching a show or engaging in some sort of entertainment with a narrative, then what you do is that you put yourself in that state of disbelief, and then you empathize. If you are a normal human being, that means that this is why pornography actually works. It's because you are imagining that you are in that movie. And it's the same when you are looking at a stage. You are imagining that you are one of those characters. And then the difference really is, who are you equating yourself to? Who are you calling your hero? There was a nice story with that Bruce Willis movie. where he's a natural born hero and fighting this protagonist in the shape of a cripple. It's always the same things, right? It's always the good and the bad mask. It's that especially when you talk about secret societies, the black and the white parts of the checkerboard, right? You are being told a story. The whole thing around you is set up to be a stage. Yep. Because you are no longer supposed to live your own life. You do not have will. You cannot write the story. They will write it for you. They will show you the rules. They will tell you whether or not you're fit to play that character or not. Because if you believe that narrative, then you will kill your own will.
Exactly. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's hence why they have these degrees of the initiation, the degrees of the adepts, how far you ascend along that narrative. And you see that in psychology all the time, and I often wonder, is this real or is this something made to control us? You see that in like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have the pyramid structure that goes all the way from, your physiological needs to your safety, your personal security, your need to belong, your esteem, and then towards eventually your self-actualization at the top of the pyramid. It's so similar to the degrees of Freemasonry, where you start out as a novice and you work your way up towards this sort of like, well, we don't know what's at the very top of the pyramid, but towards the 33 degrees. And even the way Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the pyramid was actually revised in recent times to have transcendence at the top. And the whole thing is just, even though it's psychological and it's interesting and everything, it does also have this extreme interesting occult aspect to it. And so it creeps into everything. This octopus, and it's not necessarily a pernicious or it's a dark octopus all the time, but this octopus of, we'll call it Freemasonic thought, we'll call it, that the Freemasonic idealism, it seems to have crept now into every aspect of life, especially through things like education and things like psychology, military ranks, and many things like that. And we're basically living in the West. We're living in a sort of a Freemasonic world.
Yeah, but it's also very interesting if you look at this from the perspective of computer games and game theory. There's some sort of conditioning in the pyramidal shape. It's a level-based system. That means that you get sort of conditioned to. It's very much akin to the shave and a haircut, right? That knocking on wood. You can't not finish it. You have to finish that sound, because that's the next logical step. Just like when you play online games.
The layers.
Exactly, and
because that's the dynamic.
Exactly, and when you're on a pyramid, the only next step is the next step up on the pyramid. That means that even though you have your needs met on what you find is essential, then because you are put into that pyramid grid, then something is telling you that the next thing to get is a car, a house, a wife, kids, that much salary, retirement. There's always something new to attain.
Yes, and even the challenges within those things are also put there for that reason too. The obstacles you will face along the way. Bruce Lee, the very last movie he ever made was a film called The Game of Death. And what you really see there is the modern computer game. He ascends through this sort of like Chinese pagoda through the film, and on each level is a guy he has to fight. And there's one point where he meets this guy where he is a big, tall African American
Abdul
guy.
Karim Shabar, right?
Yeah. And he basically has killed him. And Bruce Lee says, why go on? Why are you still trying to stop me when there's no hope? And he says something because, like, this is my destiny. And it's so interesting. And there it was, even in a Chinese martial arts film, we're confronted with the pyramidal structure of the Freemasonic thought process.
I like that you bring that up, because that brings in a whole other aspect. a parallel to one of the other narratives that's out there about Michael Jackson. One of the things that you will find if you read into the history of Bruce Lee is that his opinion and his life philosophy is actually the exact opposite of that movie.
He went in reverse.
He was actually talking about removing all these strict systems, about the only real path being to flow and to follow the shapes of water, and actually very much about intuition. It's it's what he called Shikundo, the way of flowing. And it's just interesting that that black and white, that in reality his opinion was exactly the opposite of what he was portraying in the movies. Why?
Yes. Well, because it was by that stage he was taking Hollywood money, and he was playing the Hollywood game. That's who was financing those films, the last two films, Enter the Dragon and The Game of Death, and that's where that came from. I wouldn't say he sold out, but whenever you have, his impact on the world is tremendous and interesting. In that, here was the first Western experience in terms of popular culture had come into contact with this guy who'd come from Hong Kong, and he brought his own philosophical and his own artistic approach to it. And whenever you have two forces colliding, you will always have you'll always have a friction. You will always have a reaction to that, and it will create something else. Now, Bruce Lee wanted to create this new, help sort of spur this new reality in the West, where, as you said, it was less rigid and less hierarchical and more, flowing in more what's the word? More of it like turbulence to it. What happened was the opposite. He had been co-opted by the Western paradigm, and it probably even killed him. We'll never know the truth to that, but there's something about the hierarchical structure, and again we're back to the psychopathic thing, where it does not know if it has flexibility. The flexibility is only within the framework it presents, never beyond that framework. That's why it's just like a soccer game. The ball, when it goes out of play, it's out of play. What happens inside the field between the two goals is all the flexibility you're allowed. And it's the same. That's why sports are such an important aspect of this as well. The boxing ring, the tennis court. We have. It's the flexibility and the dynamic interaction, the turbulence, is accepted as long as it remains within the framework of the structure that contains it. Bruce Lee, his analogy regarding water having no shape is it just would not gel with that. It just wouldn't.
This brings me into the something that I've been asking myself ever since I started looking into your themes and topics. The dynamics within the psychopathic groups, right? Because you mentioned something about the fact that they do have some sort of social structure, and that they have rules and respond to each other. But do you know anything about what goes on, how they act? And you mentioned a bit about the whole right now about the allegory of sports, and it has to take place within certain boundaries. Is there anything that you've come in contact with that shows that there's some sort of set of rule or behavior? Or
yes, psychopaths can't think outside the box, and that's not because of a lack of intelligence or an intellectual lack on their need or an intellectual deficiency. It's just that they inside that box that they're in, inside their space, and also the space they've trapped you in, they cannot allow outside exterior influence or anything that's in terms of improvisation to impinge upon that, because it takes away control. A very common statement made by a psychopath in a relationship is to say to the other person, I will love you as long as you do not change. because then they have to actually work to make that, to deal with the change. So they develop a sort of a psychological comfort zone, which they trap themselves in, and they also trap you in. And once you remain in that comfort zone, the psychopath is fine. But if you develop interest outside that comfort zone, suppose the psychopath is an atheist and you develop a spiritual insight, they will become very, very angry. They will not like that at all. And this, if you don't get back into the comfort zone, they will get rid of you.
But what about psychopath to psychopath behavior? Their own interrelationship, right? Outside the victims.
They have no interest in each other. They will cluster. They will cluster in an ad hoc way, in terms of psychopaths may rise to the top of a corporation or a government, but it's an accidental clustering, and they will be extremely suspicious and paranoid around each other, but they won't work. They don't do the teamwork thing. They psychopathic clustering in terms of it rising to the top of it. The CEOs of the boardroom of a company is completely. It's completely an organic process, in that the psychopaths didn't all band together at the bottom of the pyramid and decide, let's take this thing over, because they function as individuals and they have no use for other psychopaths. They really don't. And it's always a parasite and host situation. But what does happen, it's the scum literally floats to the top in entities and within situations and systems where psychopaths are generally, considered an asset, such as a bank, such as a hedge fund management company.
But once you reach that certain level of power or influence as a psychopath, do you still have that dynamic? Because I can understand when you're talking about what I would say lower level psychopaths, right? That they might not gather or socialize in any way. But when you reach some sort of level where it goes more to a more predatory than parasitical relationship, then I would just expect that somehow the dynamic change a bit. Because when you're talking about these, I would call everyday psychopaths that we might actually meet, they hatch onto you, as you say, as a parasite, and then they kind of use you and abuse you, and then they throw you away. But what when they get to a point where they do not actually need to feed as often? I'm almost inclined to start talking about vampires.
When they've achieved all their goals, more or less.
Yeah.
Well, what happens then is they don't stop. If they've achieved all their goals as a businessman, and they come across and they develop a corporation that's been incredibly successful, has achieved all its commercial goals, and everything has been attained, they will generally start going into sort of like what they would call altruistic things. They will begin, well, they're not altruistic really, they're ego-driven things. They will begin foundations. They will start becoming they will join the boards of other companies. They will get involved in politics. Every psychopath is driven by the internal need to be the last one standing on this earth. And even if they achieve everything and they become the head of the UN or the president of the head of NATO or the head of the IMF, it's not enough. They're driven constantly by a need that can never be filled, by an itch that can never be scratched, and they will always be looking for some other way of controlling a person. That's why, if they were the last one left on earth, they would just throw their hands in the air and say, yes, I made it, and then die of starvation. It wouldn't matter to them. They're driven by this instinctual need to conquer all, and if they get everything they want, they'll always find new things. There's a constant need to find this sort of victim supply to satisfy their predatory needs, and it never ends. It never ever ends. The fluctuation may change. Let me give you an example. When you're younger, your sexual drive is much higher. When you get older, your sexual desire decreases as you get past your mid-40s, your 50s, and then on. It's not the same as it was when you were 19. But that doesn't mean you're not attracted to sex any less. It just turns into something else. You replace that addiction with something like food or drinking or anything really, but you're still driven by it. You just don't have the energy to do it. Likewise, a psychopath, when they begin to age, they may not have the hot shot, get up and go, get out there and get them, tiger, abilities that they did when they were in their 20s. But if they're in the old people's home, they'll be doing things like stealing the other people's money, tampering with their medication, spreading rumours and lies about them. And it's just a drive for the sort of the rush that they get from doing this. They never ever change. It's just that the constraints put on them by their physiology may affect their machinations and how they go about it, but they will not change. The predatory drive is there. It's eternal. It's absolute, and it will never leave them.
It's just that from.
Sorry, Jakob. Can we wrap this up soon? I've got to go do a few things.
Yeah, sure. It's just.
Can we leave that there for now?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that.
How was that?
That was